My parents always called me the dumb one, while my sister got a full ride to Harvard. But on her graduation day, after Dad announced she would inherit everything, a stranger handed me a sealed envelope and whispered it was time they learned who I really was. The security guard checked his clipboard twice before he said it. "Miss, you're not on the list." I was standing outside the 40th floor boardroom of Ashford Tower in a blazer that belonged to my grandmother's old assistant, holding a will that could end my father's career. And a man named Gary with a lanyard and a bad haircut was telling me I wasn't on the list. "Check again," I said. He didn't have to, because that's when Margaret Coleman opened the door from the inside, looked at Gary like he'd tracked mud across her carpet, and said, "I invited her. Let her in." 12 faces turned toward me. My father's was the only one that went white. "I want you to understand something before I tell you how I got here." Standing in a doorway with shaking hands and a piece of paper that was about to detonate my family from the inside out. 3 days earlier, I didn't know this document existed. 3 years earlier, the woman who wrote it was dead. And 26 years earlier, back when I was 6 years old and couldn't make the letters on a page hold still long enough to read them, my parents had already decided who I was. They just never told me she'd decided something different. My name is Cecily Ashford. I'm 26 years old, and for 20 of those years, my parents called me the slow one. Not to my face, not exactly. They were far too polished for that, far too concerned with how the Ashford name sounded in rooms full of people who mattered. But I heard it in the pauses, in the way my mother's sentence would catch right before she introduced me at a dinner party, like she was recalibrating what she was allowed to say. "This is our younger daughter, Cecily. She's creative." Creative was the word they used instead of the word they meant. Here's what actually happened to me, the thing nobody bothered to name until I was 31 years past the age when it should have mattered. I have a reading disability, dyslexia, though nobody in my house ever said the word out loud, not even after 2 separate elementary school teachers suggested it in writing. Letters swim, rows of text blur and double. What takes another person 4 seconds to read might take me 40, and even then I might get it wrong. And by the time I was 12, I had stopped raising my hand in class because the sound of my own stammering voice trying to sound out a paragraph out loud had become the worst sound in the world to me. Some children just aren't academic, my mother told me. I was 12 years old, sitting at our kitchen island in Rye, New York, with a report card that had 2 C- on it, and she said it the way you'd comment on weather. Not academic, like it was a permanent weather system over my head that nobody could do anything about. My father, Harold Ashford, was worse in a quieter way. He simply stopped expecting things from me. My older sister Josephine got the SAT tutors, the college counselors, the summer enrichment programs in Geneva. I got taken out of that pipeline entirely by the time I was 14, quietly rerouted toward practical skills, as if reading a spreadsheet slower than my sister meant I should spend my adolescence learning to arrange flowers, instead of learning anything that might someday let me sit across a boardroom table from either of them. Ashford Holdings is a real estate investment company, $90 million in commercial and residential property across 3 states, founded in 1965 by my grandmother Genevieve Ashford in a rented office above a dry cleaner in Poughkeepsie. By the time I was born, it was my father's company on paper, though everyone who'd worked there more than a decade knew whose instincts had actually built it. Josephine got groomed to inherit that company from the time she could walk. I got groomed to disappear into the background of family photos. Here's the part that took me 20 years to understand. I wasn't broken. I just process information differently. Where words on a page turned into static, I could look at a flowchart, a floor plan, a set of financial relationships laid out visually, and see the architecture of it instantly. Patterns other people had to build sentence by sentence, I could see in a single glance. I didn't know that skill had a name or a value. I just knew it was the only thing that made my brain feel quiet instead of loud. Only one person in my life ever noticed that quiet thing was actually something. My grandmother. Genevieve Ashford was 78 years old by the time I really got to know her, though she'd technically retired from day-to-day operations a decade before that. Every Sunday, without fail, she'd drive the 40 minutes from her house in Millbrook to ours. And while my parents took Josephine to whatever academic competition was on the calendar that week, my grandmother would sit with me at her old roll-top desk and pull out property blueprints, zoning maps, cash flow diagrams from the 70s that she'd kept in a filing cabinet nobody else cared about. "Tell me what you see," she'd say, sliding a floor plan across the desk, and I'd tell her, not read it, see it. The load-bearing walls that didn't line up with the original permits. The unit that had been subdivided without anyone updating the tax records. The stairwell that violated fire code in a building my father's firm had bought 2 years earlier. "You see things others miss," she told me once. I was 15. "That's not weakness, Cecily. That's vision. Your sister can read a contract faster than anyone I've ever met, but you can see the building the contract is describing. Don't ever let anyone convince you those aren't both worth something." She died 3 years ago. Aortic aneurysm, sudden, in her sleep, at 81 years old. I was 23. I remember standing at her funeral thinking that the only person who had ever looked at me like I was a whole person instead of a disappointing footnote had just been buried, and that whatever she'd seen in me was going to go into the ground with her. I was wrong about that. It just took 3 years, 1 email, and 1 graduation party for me to find out how wrong. 2 days before everything changed, I got an email with the subject line, "Position Restructuring." I worked in Ashford Holdings Property Management Division, not because my father had faith in my judgment, but because it was the one department where my visual pattern skills were tolerated rather than mocked. I found structural problems inspectors missed. I flagged maintenance issues before they became 6-figure repairs. I was good at my job. I'd been good at my job for 4 years. The email was from HR CCing my father, informing me that my role was being restructured out of the current organizational chart effective end of quarter, with vague language about realignment of resources and a mention of a severance package that was frankly insulting given how long I'd been there. The same week, my father announced, not to me, I found out through a company-wide memo, that my sister Josephine would be taking over as Vice President of Strategic Operations, the traditional stepping stone role before eventually inheriting the CEO title itself. Fired and disinherited in the same 7 days. I want to tell you I was shocked. I wasn't. I was tired in the specific way you get tired when a thing you always suspected finally just says itself out loud. Then came the party. Josephine graduated from Harvard Business School's executive MBA program on a Saturday in early June, and my parents threw her a party that cost, by my rough estimate walking through the rented event space beforehand, somewhere north of $200,000. 300 guests. A ballroom at the Rytown Hilton with the good chandeliers, the ones that actually use crystal instead of that cheaper cut glass everyone pretends not to notice. A 12-foot banner behind the head table that said, "Congratulations, Josephine," in gold script lettering, professionally printed, not the kind you get same day from a party store. I sat at table 14, not the head table, not even the second table. Table 14, near the kitchen doors, next to my second cousin's +1, a man I'd never met who spent 40 minutes describing his fantasy football league to me in complete and total sincerity. At 8:40 p.m., my father tapped his champagne glass with a fork, and the room went quiet the way rooms do for men like Harold Ashford. "Tonight isn't just about a diploma," he said, one hand on Josephine's shoulder, the other holding his glass high enough that the chandelier light refracted through it onto his face. "Tonight is about the future of this family's legacy." Effective immediately, Josephine will be named Vice President of Strategic Operations at Ashford Holdings, with a clear and unambiguous path to the CEO title within 5 years. And I want everyone in this room to know, he paused, the kind of pause a man takes when he knows the next sentence is the one everyone will repeat in the parking lot afterward. "Josephine will inherit my entire estate." Standing ovation. Camera flashes. My Aunt Deborah actually wiped away a tear. Nobody looked at me. Not one person in a room of 300 turned to check how the other daughter was taking this. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it's the most honest sentence I can give you about what those 20 years had built. A room full of people who had been trained, the same way I had, to simply not look in my direction when the important things were being said. I was refilling my water glass near the kitchen doors, mostly to have something to do with my hands, when a man in a gray suit approached my table. Not from the direction of the bar, from the direction of the coat check, like he'd been waiting for the right moment. "Miss Ashford," he said. I assumed he meant Josephine, so I started to point toward the head table. "No," he said. "Cecily Ashford. I need a moment if you have one." He was maybe 60, silver-haired, with the specific, unhurried posture of a man who bills by the hour and has never once had to rush for anyone. He introduced himself as Jonathan Woods and said the words that made the room tilt slightly around me. "I was your grandmother's attorney." I hadn't heard my grandmother's estate mentioned by anyone outside the family in 3 years. Her will had been settled, or so I thought, within 4 months of her death. My father had handled all of it. I'd signed whatever I'd been told to sign, half of which I'd had Josephine read to me because the font on the estate documents was small and dense, and I hadn't wanted to ask my father to slow down for me at his own mother's funeral proceedings. "My grandmother's been gone 3 years, I said. "I'm aware," Jonathan said. "She retained me specifically, outside of your father's usual counsel, 5 years before she passed. She gave me very particular instructions about a document and about the precise circumstances under which I was permitted to deliver it to you." He reached into his jacket and produced a cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. Not a modern sticker made to look like wax, but the real thing, pressed with what I'd later learn was my grandmother's own monogrammed seal, a G and an A intertwined that she'd used on personal correspondence since the 1970s. "She told me to wait," he said, "until your father showed you, unmistakably, who he really is." He glanced past me toward the head table, where my father was still posing for photos with his arm around Josephine, both of them lit up gold under that ridiculous banner. I believe that just happened. I didn't open it at the table. I walked it to the hallway outside the kitchen, past a cart of dirty champagne flutes and a busboy who didn't look up, and I broke the wax seal with hands that would not stop shaking. Not delicate tremors, actual visible shaking, the kind where you have to press your palm flat against a wall to steady yourself. Inside was a will, not a letter. A formal, notarized last will and testament dated September 12, 2019, 4 years after the 2015 will my father had always operated as though was final and absolute. I read the relevant paragraph 3 times before the words settled into something my brain could actually hold on to, which tells you something, because reading was always the hard part for me. And that night the words weren't hard to decode, they were just hard to believe. I bequeath 51% of my shares in Ashford Holdings, along with all associated voting rights, to my granddaughter, Cecily Ann Ashford. 51% controlling interest. There was a second document clipped behind the will, a letter. This one typed but signed in my grandmother's unmistakable looping hand, addressed to me directly. And there was a condition in the will itself, cold and specific in the way legal language always is. The beneficiary had 72 hours from the date of formal notice to petition for an emergency board meeting to present the superseding will, or the bequest would revert to the estate's default distribution, which, without my action, meant it would simply fold into whatever my father had already arranged for Josephine. 72 hours. My grandmother grandmother had built in an expiration date on her own generosity, and I understood, standing in that hallway with wax flakes still stuck to my fingers, exactly why. She hadn't wanted to hand me a company. She'd wanted to see whether I'd fight for it. Whether the 15-year-old girl who used to read floor plans at her roll-top desk had grown into someone who could stand in a room and refuse to disappear. She'd been planning this for 5 years, waiting for the exact moment my father proved in public, in front of 300 witnesses, that he'd chosen one daughter over the other so completely that there could be no ambiguity left about what he actually believed I was worth. I called Jonathan Woods before I even left the parking lot. I need to understand what happens next, I told him, sitting in my car with the engine off, the ballroom lights still visible through the Hilton's windows. Then let's start with what's already been done, he said. Your grandmother didn't leave this to chance. There's someone else you need to call tonight. Margaret Coleman. Margaret Coleman had been on the Ashford Holdings board for 32 years. She'd joined in 1994, the same year my father, then 30 years old, had first started pushing my grandmother to expand into commercial properties she considered too aggressive an acquisition strategy. Margaret had been my grandmother's closest ally on that board for 3 decades, the person Genevieve trusted to see through my father's polish to whatever was actually underneath it. I called her at 11:15 that night. The ballroom party still going on somewhere behind me, my phone at 4% battery. I've been wondering when you'd call, Margaret said, before I'd said more than my name. You knew about the will. I was one of 2 witnesses who signed it, she said. Genevieve told me you might not call for years. She told me if you never called, that would be its own kind of answer, and I should let the 72-hour window lapse without ever mentioning it to you. She didn't want to hand you a fight you weren't ready to have. She wanted you to choose it. I sat with that for a moment. My grandmother had died with this document already drafted, already signed, already sitting in a locked file at Jonathan Woods' office, and she had trusted a 60-something-year-old woman named Margaret Coleman to decide, based on nothing but whether I picked up a phone, whether I deserved to know a company existed with my name on 51% of it. What do? I said. It wasn't really a question. It came out flatter than that. You petitioned for an emergency board meeting, Margaret said, under Ashford Holdings bylaws. I have them in front of me right now, Cecily. I pulled them the moment Jonathan called to tell me the notice had gone out. Any shareholder with a documented claim exceeding 10% equity can compel an emergency session with 72 hours written notice to the full board. You have 51%. Nobody can legally deny this meeting. Your father can be furious about it. He cannot stop it. How do I even file that? You don't, she said. I do. Tonight. I need your signature on the petition, and I need one more board member's signature alongside mine to satisfy the quorum request bylaw. I already know who that's going to be. That one more signature turned out to require exactly 1 phone call and 2 names. Richard Hunter, who had sat on the board since 2001 and had grown visibly tired of what Margaret later described to me delicately as Harold's temperament in closed session, and Susan Price, who'd joined more recently and had apparently kept meticulous private notes on several of my father's more aggressive unilateral decisions that had never gone to a formal vote the way the bylaws required. By 1:40 a.m., the petition was filed. The emergency board meeting was set for 10:20 a.m. the following Tuesday. 40th floor, Ashford Tower. 72 hours, almost to the minute from the moment Jonathan Woods had handed me that envelope. My father found out about it 6 hours before I did, or at least 6 hours before I found out that he knew. I know because Josephine called me at 6:50 the next morning, her voice sharp enough to cut. What did you do? She said. No hello. Nothing you won't find out about tomorrow, I said, and I meant for it to sound calm, but it came out flat and strange, like I was reading someone else's line. Cecily, whatever this is, I'll see you at 10:20, I said, and I hung up before she could finish, my hand shaking against the phone exactly the way it had shaken against that wax seal 2 nights before. I want to walk you through what those 72 hours actually felt like, because it wasn't one clean, triumphant march toward a boardroom. It was 5 distinct moments where I almost folded. The first came on Sunday morning, less than 12 hours after I'd filed the petition, when my mother called, not my father, my mother, which told me something about the strategy being deployed against me before she'd said a single word. Your grandmother wasn't well at the end, she said. You understand that, don't you? The medications she was on for her heart, they can affect judgment. This document, whatever it is, it isn't the woman we knew. I told myself for about 4 minutes that maybe she had a point. My grandmother had been 81. People that age sign things. I actually opened my email to look at the notarization date again, some part of me hunting for a reason this could be dismissed instead of pursued. Then I called Jonathan Woods and asked him directly. Your grandmother executed that will in my office, he told me, 11 months before her death, during a session where I specifically required a cognitive assessment from her physician as a precaution. Not because I doubted her, but because I anticipated exactly this argument would eventually be made. I have that assessment. She scored in the top percentile for her age bracket. I can produce it within the hour if your father's counsel challenges competency. My mother's 4 minutes of doubt died right there. The second moment came Sunday evening when my father showed up at my apartment, not called, showed up, standing in my hallway in the same navy suit he'd worn to the party, minus the tie. You have no idea what you're about to do to this family, he said, still in the doorway, not asking to come in. I have a document that says I do, I said. That document is a fantasy your grandmother cooked up to punish me for decisions she disagreed with 30 years ago, he said. This isn't about you, Cecily. It never was. This is about her and me. That one almost worked, if I'm honest. There's a particular kind of gravity a father's disappointment has, even at 26, even when you know intellectually that his disappointment has never once been a fair or accurate measurement of anything. I stood in that doorway feeling feeling 12 years old again, feeling the C- report card, feeling some children just aren't academic pressing against my chest. Then I thought about the flowcharts, the floor plans. You see things others miss. And I said the only thing that felt true. Then let the board decide whose fantasy it is. He left without another word. The third moment was a phone call from an unknown number Monday morning, a man who identified himself as an attorney representing the estate's interests. So it took me exactly one follow-up question to Jonathan to confirm this was outside counsel my father had retained privately, someone with no actual standing regarding Genevieve's estate, but who was clearly hoping I didn't know that. He suggested, in language dense enough that 3 years ago I might have simply agreed to anything to end the discomfort of trying to parse it, that I should consider a private settlement that would give me a modest lump sum in exchange for withdrawing the petition entirely. I didn't need to read every clause of what he was proposing. I could see the shape of it, the way you can look at a floor plan and know instantly that a wall isn't load-bearing even before you check the blueprint. It was a buyout, a number designed to feel large enough to a 26-year-old former restructured employee that I'd take it and disappear quietly, the same way I'd been trained to disappear quietly my whole life. I'll have my attorney review anything in writing, I told him, and hung up. The fourth moment was smaller, almost embarrassing in hindsight. Tuesday, the morning of the meeting itself, standing in front of my closet realizing I didn't own a single blazer appropriate for a corporate boardroom, because I had never once in 4 years of employment at Ashford Holdings been invited into one. I ended up borrowing one from my grandmother's former assistant, Patricia, a woman 2 sizes smaller than me who'd kept a closet of my grandmother's old professional clothes rather than donate them. The blazer didn't fit. I wore it anyway. Some fights you show up to in ill-fitting clothes because showing up matters more than looking the part. The fifth moment was the one at the door itself. Gary the security guard, the clipboard, the words "you're not on the list," and Margaret Coleman opening that door from the inside before I had to find out whether I would have turned around and left. I want to be honest about something. People tell these stories afterward like the moment of triumph and skip the part where the person almost didn't make it to the moment of triumph at all. I nearly didn't. 5 separate times in 72 hours, I nearly folded the way I'd folded my entire childhood. The only difference this time was that a woman who'd been dead for 3 years had left behind exactly enough structural support: an attorney, a board ally, a documented medical assessment, a legal deadline that couldn't be argued away. That folding actually became harder than standing. That's what my grandmother had built for me, I realized much later. Not a company, a scaffold, something to hold the walls up while I figured out whether I had the nerve to walk into the building. 12 board members sat around a long walnut table on the 40th floor of Ashford Tower, floor-to-ceiling windows behind them showing the Hudson River flat and gray under an overcast June sky. My father sat at the head, where he'd sat for the 15 years since my grandmother formally stepped back. Josephine sat 2 seats down from him, in a suit that actually fit her, looking at me like she still couldn't decide whether to be furious or frightened. Robert Hunter, the board chairman, not to be confused with Richard Hunter, his cousin, who'd co-signed the petition, a detail that had confused me until Margaret clarified their relationship the night before, called the meeting to order at exactly 10:22 a.m. This emergency session was called under Article 7, Section 3 of Ashford Holdings bylaws, he said, reading from a printed agenda, at the request of shareholder Cecily Ashford, represented by counsel Jonathan Woods, regarding a claim of superseding testamentary transfer of controlling equity interest. Miss Ashford has the floor. My father started to rise. Robert, before this goes any further, I want the board to understand that this so-called document is Mr. Ashford, Robert said, not unkindly, but without room for negotiation. You'll have your opportunity to respond once the petitioner has presented her claim. That's the order this board agreed to 20 minutes before you arrived. I opened the leather portfolio Jonathan had given me the night before. He sat 1 chair behind me, present as counsel but under the bylaws not permitted to speak for me directly in front of the board, which meant every word in that room in the next 20 minutes had to come out of my own mouth. I placed the will on the table. This is the last will and testament of Genevieve Margaret Ashford, I said, and my voice did not shake, which surprised me more than anyone else in that room. Notarized September 12, 2019, executed in the office of Jonathan Woods, with a contemporaneous cognitive assessment from her treating physician, Dr. Elaine Marsh, confirming testamentary capacity at the time of signing. That's impossible, my father said. My mother's will was executed in 2015. I have a certified copy in my own files. You have a certified copy of her earlier will, I said. This one is dated 4 years later. Under New York estate law, a properly executed subsequent will revokes all prior instruments to the extent they conflict, provided the later will meets the same formal execution requirements, which this one does, and which Mr. Woods can confirm in detail if the board requires it. I slid the document across the table toward Robert Hunter. He put on his reading glasses, and the room went silent except for the sound of pages turning. She left 51% of her shares along with associated voting rights to me, I continued, while he read, because I understood, the way I understood floor plans, the way I understood which wall in a room actually held the weight, that silence in that moment would look like uncertainty, and I could not afford to look uncertain. That constitutes controlling interest in Ashford Holdings. I'm not here to ask this board's permission for something I already legally hold. I'm here because the bylaws require me to formally present the claim before the board can update its records and my father's and my sister's operational authority accordingly. This is a forgery, my father said, but there was a specific quality to his voice now, a register I'd never heard from him before, something underneath the anger that sounded for the first time in my life like fear. Then I'd invite you to have your own counsel examine the notarized authorization and Dr. Marsh's assessment, I said. Mr. Woods retained an independent handwriting analyst as a precaution 11 months ago, anticipating exactly this challenge. I have her findings here as well. I slid a second folder across the table, the one Jonathan had prepared, the one I'd read 4 times the night before with my thumb pressed under each line to keep the words from swimming, because some habits from being 12 years old with a report card full of C-minuses never fully leave you, and I had needed those words to be exactly right. Susan Price, the newer board member Margaret had brought in on the petition, spoke for the first time. Robert, I think for the integrity of this session, we should have Mr. Woods speak to the chain of custody on these documents directly. Miss Ashford is not an attorney, and I don't think it's fair to ask her to answer every procedural question herself. I'd welcome that, I said before my father could object, because I understood something in that moment too, that letting Jonathan speak to the mechanics wasn't a weakness. It was exactly the kind of delegation my grandmother used to do constantly, trusting the right expert with the right piece of the puzzle instead of insisting on holding every piece herself. Jonathan Woods spent the next 11 minutes walking the board through the will's execution, the physician's assessment, and the independent forensic document examiner's report confirming the signature and notary seal were consistent with 3 other verified samples of my grandmother's handwriting from the same period. He used the words chain of custody twice, testamentary capacity 4 times, and at one point produced Dr. Sau Marsh's letter itself on her practice's letterhead, stating in plain clinical language that Genevieve Ashford had exhibited no cognitive impairment consistent with reduced capacity at the time of the September 2019 signing. My father's counsel, the same attorney who'd called me privately on Monday about a settlement, now sitting visibly rigid 2 chairs down from him, asked several pointed questions about the timeline. Jonathan answered each one without hesitation, because he'd clearly anticipated every single one 5 years in advance, the same way my grandmother had anticipated every objection my father would ever raise. At 11:47 a.m., Robert Hunter removed his glasses and looked at my father. Harold, he said, I've been on this board for 19 years, and I've never once had reason to doubt Genevieve's judgment. I'm not going to start now, 3 years after her death, based on nothing but your insistence that this is impossible. The documentation is thorough. It's notarized, medically supported, and independently verified. Unless your counsel can produce something beyond assertion in the next 48 hours, I intend to move that this board formally recognize Cecily Ashford's 51% controlling interest and associated voting rights, effective immediately upon this session's minutes being finalized. You can't be serious, Josephine said. It was the first time she'd spoken. I'm entirely serious, Robert said. And frankly, Josephine, I'd ask you to consider something on your own time, not this board's. Your grandmother built this company from a single office above a dry cleaner. She spent 5 years quietly constructing a legal mechanism to ensure that if your father ever demonstrated, unambiguously, that he valued one daughter over the other to the point of erasing the second one from the family's future entirely, a 51% controlling stake would land in the hands of the daughter he'd tried to erase. That's not a fluke of estate law. That's a woman who knew her son extremely well and built a door that only opened if he walked through exactly the doorway she was watching for. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Margaret Coleman spoke quietly, for the first time since the meeting had started. I move to recognize the will, she said. Seconded, said Richard Hunter. The vote passed 9-3. My father, Josephine, and one board member I later learned owed his seat directly to my father's recommendation were the only 3 dissenting votes, and dissent at that point changed absolutely nothing. I need to be precise here because the truth is more complicated and, I think, more honest than a simple story of my father losing everything overnight. He did not lose his job that day. The board's vote recognized my controlling equity and voting rights. It did not, on its own, remove him as CEO. What it did was something quieter and, in its way, more devastating for a man like Harold Ashford. It removed the fiction that he operated with unchecked authority. Within 6 weeks, under my direction as majority shareholder, the board commissioned an independent financial review of the previous 3 years of operations, not out of vindictiveness, but because Margaret Coleman pointed out correctly that a controlling shareholder taking over without understanding exactly what she now controlled would be its own kind of failure. The forensic accountant the board retained, a woman named Priya Anand with over 20 years of experience specializing in closely held family real estate entities, spent 11 weeks going through the books. She found what she later described to me, in a conference room with considerably less crystal chandelier lighting than that ballroom had, as a pattern of related party transactions inconsistent with arm's-length dealing. In plainer terms, my father had, over the preceding 4 years, directed several property acquisitions through a shell entity co-owned with his brother-in-law, my Uncle Peter, at prices meaningfully above independent market appraisals, generating profit for Peter's separate holding company at Ashford Holdings' expense. Nothing that rose to criminal fraud, Priya was careful to clarify, but a clear breach of the fiduciary duty a CEO owes to the company he serves, and grounds under the bylaws for the board to remove him from operational leadership without severance. The board voted to remove him as CEO 4 months after that first emergency meeting, with a transition period during which, and this detail matters to me, I insisted he be treated with more dignity than he had ever once extended to me. No public announcement framing him as disgraced. A quiet press release citing leadership transition to align with the company's founding vision. He kept his equity stake, which remained substantial even without the 51% my grandmother had redirected to me. He did not go to prison. He did not lose his house. He lost the one thing he had built his entire entire identity around, being the undisputed head of Ashford Holdings. Josephine's path surprised me more than anyone else's. I half expected her to disappear from the company entirely, humiliated, the golden child suddenly guilt-flaked and ordinary. Instead, 3 weeks after the board vote, she called me, not Dad, me, and asked if we could get coffee. I didn't know, she said, twisting a napkin into a tight coil on the table between us. About the reading thing, I mean, I knew you struggled in school. I didn't know there was I didn't know it had a name. Nobody ever told me. Nobody told me either, I said. Not really, not in a way that mattered. I got everything, she said. The tutors, the counselors. I used to think you just didn't try as hard as me. I could have been cruel there. I'd earned the right to be, probably, after 20 years. I didn't take it. I used to think that too, I said, for a long time. We didn't fix everything over one cup of coffee. That's not how families actually work, whatever the ending of a story like this might make you want to believe. But Josephine took a leave from her VP role, went back to school part-time to study organizational psychology, and eventually came back to Ashford Holdings in a role she and I designed together. One that had nothing to do with inheritance and everything to do with what she was actually good at, which turned out to be people, not property. I'm writing this almost exactly 1 year after that graduation party. Ashford Holdings' 40th floor boardroom looks the same as it did that first Tuesday morning. Same walnut table, same view of the Hudson, same slightly too cold air conditioning that Margaret Coleman has been complaining about since 1994, according to her. I sit at that table now, not at the head. Robert Hunter still chairs board sessions, and I've learned enough in a year to understand there's real wisdom in not rushing to occupy every seat of power just because you legally can. But I sit close enough that when I have something to say, the room turns to listen the way it never once turned to listen to me at that ballroom party or at any dinner table before it. I hired a reading specialist 8 months ago. For myself, first, 41 years too late by some measures, but better late than the alternative. And I've started slowly to read the way most people take for granted. It's still not fast. It probably never will be. But I've stopped being ashamed of a pace that was never actually a measure of my intelligence, just a measure of a brain that was wired to see a different kind of pattern. I kept my grandmother's old roll-top desk. It's in my office now, on the 38th floor, one floor below the boardroom. And some Sundays, not every Sunday but some, I still pull out old blueprints, not because I need to solve anything, but because sitting with them feels like sitting with her. My father and I speak occasionally, not often, not easily, but occasionally, which is more than I would have predicted a year ago. He apologized to me exactly once, 4 months after the board vote, in a conversation neither of us has repeated since. And I don't know if I fully believe every word of it, but I believe he meant it more than he'd meant anything he'd said to me in the 20 years before. Josephine and I have dinner most Sundays now, sometimes at my apartment, sometimes at hers. Last week she told me she was thinking about going back for a doctorate in organizational behavior. I told her I thought Grandma would have liked that. She cried a little, and so did I, and neither of us apologized for it. The banner from her graduation party, the 12-foot one with her name in gold script, is long gone, thrown out with the rest of the party rentals within a week, the way those things always are. Nobody photographs the takedown. Nobody remembers the banner a year later. What I remember is a man in a gray suit finding my table near the kitchen doors at the one party in my entire life where nobody had thought to look for me, and handing me an envelope my grandmother had sealed 5 years before she died, waiting, with more patience than I think I could have managed myself, for the exact moment my father would prove, without meaning to, exactly who he was. She was right in the end about both of us. She was right that he'd eventually show me. And she was right, all those Sunday afternoons at her roll-top desk, that I saw things other people missed. I just needed someone to believe that was worth 51% of everything, long before I believed it myself.